Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for joining us again. Started a little bit later here in the month, but probably pretty good time as some storms are starting to fire up. We saw a little bit of moisture yesterday. We saw some things last week. And for a lot of people, probably in the central region, can just feel it in the air tonight as the humidity is a little bit higher. Um, so, what I would encourage you guys all to do, if you guys have questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Brian or myself can see him. We can answer those probably likely towards the end as he works through this and maybe even answers them as he goes. But yeah, there's some exciting things, hopefully here in the next 30 days. And then we also are going to talk about what this looks like as we go into summer and then head into fall and what's in store for us there. So I would encourage you, if you have questions, type them in and we'll cover them there at the end. If not, you guys can shoot me a text and we'll respond that way. But with that, I will pass this over to Brian.
All right, great. Thanks, Scotty. And for everybody that's on tonight, a lot of important things to analyze going forward, especially even just in the short term here over the next few days or so. And we'll kind of talk more about that going forward. But, the past 30 days have obviously been a lot drier than average. And that's what this map shows right here in front of us. The only real exception to the rule has been down from eastern New Mexico, parts of the panhandle of Texas, north central Texas, and then you can see those deeper blue anomalies across East Texas and parts of the Gulf Coast states. We've also had a more active storm track across northwest Nebraska, north central Nebraska, on up into the northern plains. So it's really just been this area of southern Nebraska, all of Kansas, down in north central Oklahoma, right in that midsection that's really been struggling because some of the storms that have been coming through have been either coming to a little bit too far south or going through a little bit too far north, which kind of stinks because the overall weather pattern has remained fairly active. With some bigger pieces of energy coming out. So it's really just about getting one of these to come through and kind of stick. And that's kind of what some of our models are looking at, going forward over the next, say, couple of weeks or so. So let's look at this. This is the Euromodel precipitation forecast for the next couple of weeks. And this is built off an ensemble. So what that means is it's looking at all 51 different members of the model. Some of the stuff that you see on social media may only be looking at one particular member of the model. And I think that does whoever's looking at it a disservice, frankly, because when you're only taking into one member out of 51, that can kind of skew things one way or another. So what this particular graphic does is it takes all 51 members into account and it averages it out. It throws those high ends out, those low ends out, and it kind of gives you a best case scenario of what is likely going to occur. And what you can see from this over the next couple of weeks is there's some pretty significant moisture showing up here, especially across the eastern 2/3 of Kansas, most of Nebraska, down into the most of Oklahoma, north central Texas. The one problem with this is that the way these storms are coming out, they are largely missing and creating a bigger bullseye over southeast Colorado, far southwest Kansas, down into the western panhandles, and then eastern New Mexico. Most of New Mexico has actually been in the worst shape because of how the storms are coming out. So over the next couple of weeks, there will be some pretty significant rains take place across the midsection of the country, probably the most significant so far of 2024, which isn't saying a whole lot considering some of the best moisture that we had in the region took place back in December. If we look at the GFS model, looking at the same period of time, it generally has the same outlook with just a little bit of a different bullseye placement here or there. But bottom line, the next couple of weeks are looking a whole lot more active than what we've seen recently. And I would say that the storm that's coming out tomorrow, really, there's going to be some storms come out of southern Nebraska tonight and push down into Kansas, but also the energy that's coming out tomorrow will likely produce some additional storms. Some of those may be on the rough side with big hail, some tornadic threat, depending on how widespread they get. I still have some question about that as far as how widespread they are. But the thing on Saturday that takes place, I think, is really going to bullseye the eastern, say, half or third of Kansas into western Missouri, down across parts of Oklahoma and Texas. And I think that's what's accounting for the darker shades of reds and even some blacks in there in terms of how much water we could potentially see over the next couple of weeks. That's just the first two storms. We have a few more in the pipeline thereafter that are likely going to contribute to this too. The forecast over the next 45 days, okay, if we look at the anomaly forecast from the Euro model over the next 45 days, it still has a pretty significant bullseye of moisture across the eastern half of Kansas, down into Oklahoma, North Texas. And again, it still has some dry anomalies over southwest Kansas, the panhandles. But those dry anomalies aren't huge. And I say that because you say, well, look at that. We might be a quarter inch less than average over the next month and a half. Remember, as we round out April, go into May and early part of June, there can be some pretty significant rains that take place during that time. So even though those dry anomalies are still technically lingering in those places, I'm more optimistic about the fact that May still looks fairly active across the midsection of the country. And I know that I've been advertising that now for a while. And that's a good thing, hopefully, because March and April have largely failed us. And anytime we have a dry March and a dry April, that always bugs me because that puts a lot of pressure on the month of May to at least get us back to where we should be. So hopefully we can achieve that. Temperature-wise, over the next 45 days, I think it goes without saying that we're going to be warmer than average there in the midsection of the country. Some cases probably on the order of about 2 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit above average, which is pretty significant in terms of warmth. So I don't really see a whole lot of late season cold coming down. That's not to say that we couldn't see one come down that cools us off for a period of time, but in terms of anything huge that lasts for a few days that comes southward, I don't see that happening, at least across most of the midsection of the country over the next month and a half or so. In terms of what is going on with our sea surface temperature anomalies, and I use that to always build into the long range forecast discussion, there hasn't been a great deal of change in a few of these things since we chatted last. We still have colder than average water across parts of the Northeast Pacific. That's that negative or cold PDO that I always talk about. We have colder than average water from the Baja back toward Hawaii. That's that negative PMM. We have a warm pocket of water out there across a large part of the Atlantic Ocean, especially off the west coast of Africa. And then we have some lingering warm anomalies here across the ENSO region, but those are rapidly changing. El Nino conditions are basically done. They have been done now for a while, and that ENSO region continues to cool as we steam toward what inevitably will be the developing La Nina episode, which we've been talking about. The Euro-seasonal model sea surface temperature anomaly forecast is what you're looking at here. That takes us from now through October. So you can see all of those, all of the orange and the reds there in the Pacific Ocean, the equatorial Pacific, go away and be replaced by those blue colors, which are the cold anomalies, essentially saying that's what La Nina is going to do. The one thing here that is a little bit different with the Euro models, it doesn't have this big nasty La Nina developing. It kind of brings it on much slowly, and it's a lot more, a lot weaker, I should say, than some other models. So am I leaning toward this? Probably not. I'm probably leaning a little bit more toward this model, the NMME model, which shows something that not only comes on much more quickly, but also much stronger. You can see some of those darker blues showing up right there. And this goes right through the end of this year, right into December. And you can see that that La Nina is not only strong, but it also has some staying power in there. And inevitably, this is likely what will be one of our main forecast drivers in the long range going forward over the next several months. So that at least gives us a little bit of credence in our forecast, knowing that we at least have something significant like this driving it. But what it eventually produces and the outcome of it, I think, is still largely in question. So these years that you see before you really haven't changed a whole lot since we chatted last. These are the El Nino to La Nina analog years here. And I have just the May analog up there for all of those years in the past. This is the average precipitation anomalies that have occurred for May during those years. And you see, historically speaking, those dry anomalies show up there across the northern plains, parts of the Midwest, eastern Kansas, down into north central and northeast parts of Oklahoma. But even though history is showing this, I'm not entirely convinced that those dry anomalies are going to win out there in central and eastern Kansas. I think if anything, especially the way the deck is stacked right now, some of those dry anomalies will be situated a little bit more to the west and the southwest, simply because those areas have been drier. The soil moisture is a lot more is a lot less than areas are likely going to end up being here to the east. So we have some adjusting to take place here in terms of that. Now, if we look at June to August here, of those analog years, you can see where the dryness really starts to stack up across New Mexico, West Texas. Kansas, for the most part during those years, really fared fairly well when you average all of those out. And we actually had some pretty wet conditions across most of the Corn Belt during those years too. So I know there's been a lot of talk about how dry and how hot this summer is going to be for the midsection of the country. I would just simply say we need to wait a little bit on that and see how May performs. If May is largely a failure, then I say we can maybe get more on the bandwagon in terms of that. But if we load up a lot of the soil with decent moisture over the next, say, 30 to 45 days across especially the eastern 2/3 of Kansas, then that's really going to pave the way for inevitably what we see during the course of summer. And I think that's kind of what this map is telling us, is to just be patient a little bit and see how May develops for let it unfold on how this upcoming summer is going to be. And I do recognize that there are some signals that could possibly be drier than average and hotter than average. But if we put a lot of water in the ground here over the next month or so, that wet soil will heat up a lot slower. It will bubble that moisture out of the soil and produce more frequent thunderstorms, and that kind of skews the forecast into something that might inevitably look like something that you're looking at right now in June through August. So I think we need to wait on that just a little bit. Now, the back half of the year, or really the back third of the year, if you will, September to December, I feel much more confident in there being a lot drier than average conditions there where you see it. And historically speaking, whenever we go from this El Nino to a pretty significant La Nina episode, we dry out the southern half of the country for the most part, with the exception out there on the Pacific coast. And you can see where some of those bigger dry anomalies show up. Southeast Kansas, down across Oklahoma, Arkansas, parts of the Gulf Coast, and then obviously back westward across Texas, New Mexico, and into Arizona. There's one analog year that I have been having my eye on now for quite some time, and that's 2020. So what you're looking at here on the right, those are the sea surface temperature anomalies right now. Over on the left, those were the sea surface temperature anomalies on April 23rd of 2020. And you can see some similarities in there. You also see some differences, but I wanted to look at this year because it was one of those years where we came out of a weaker El Nino and we went right into that triple La Nina episode. And if you just take these two maps at face value, you can see back in 2020, the Northeast Pacific was warmer than it is now. We still had some cooler than average water from the Baja to Hawaii. We had some cooler water building off the west coast of South America, and we had warm water in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, on the right, you see the Northeast Pacific is a little cooler than it was back in 2020, and the Atlantic is a whole lot warmer. I know we're kind of looking at these in comparison to say, well, is there ever going to be a perfect match? No, there's not. That's just not how this works. But you try to look for some similarities in these sea surface temperature anomalies to project forward. And this is what we got back in 2020, April to May. And you can see where the dry anomalies were spot on back then with the way the sea surface temperatures were stacked up. Eastern New Mexico, West Texas, Southwest Kansas, all of Colorado, and on up into the upper Midwest. Do I really think this is how the rest of this month and into May are going to perform? I actually don't. I think some of these dry anomalies are going to be shoved farther west and farther southwest than what 2020 actually ended up doing. And I think that's because back in 2020, it may have been a little bit farther along in terms of the transition, if you will, to La Nina versus what we are now. If we looked at what happened in June to August during that time, you see that we moistened things up across parts of Kansas versus where we were before. The dry anomalies really existed across up across I-80 in eastern Nebraska, Iowa, and extending its way eastward into the Corn Belt. And we had some real big dry anomalies back to the west and the southwest during that time. If we went to September to November of that year, we were pretty much spot on with the way things inevitably unfolded, with the dryness really starting to show up across the midsection and back to the west and to the southwest. The really only wetter areas were across the southeastern part of the country. So is 2020 our top analog right now for what could happen? I don't think necessarily. I think it could be close, but as I said, a lot hinges on what happens over the next 30 days or so. I made no mistake, even back a month or so ago when we spoke, saying really the next 60 to 80 days were super critical in determining the future because it all really depended on how much water we could put in the ground in a short period of time. So this upcoming weather pattern for the next couple of weeks is kind of building on that theory, if you will, and we'll see just kind of how things play out with that. I'm at least optimistic that folks in some places are going to see a lot more water than what they've seen. This is the May forecast for off the Euro seasonal model here, which is forecasting a lot wetter than average conditions there across most of really all of Texas, Oklahoma, the eastern half of Kansas, even southwest Kansas starts to see some better moisture in that. Again, this is forecast for the month of May. If we look at what happens during the month of June, well, then we start to see things unfold in a largely negative fashion for western Kansas, which I do think areas out west are obviously going to be drier than areas farther east. That's just the way the pattern has been stacked lately. That's probably the way we're going to continue going forward. So you see the dryness really starting to flex out in the western half of the state. Eastern Kansas, you still have some wet anomalies there, but really the more wet anomalies exist up there across parts of the Corn Belt and in the upper Midwest. If we look at July, same kind of story. Still wet across parts of the Corn Belt. The real dry area is out there to the west. And I want to draw your attention down across parts of north central Mexico, because where you're seeing the darker browns and the red, that's essentially forecasting some pretty significant dry anomalies during the heart of what is Mexico's monsoon season. And if that monsoon in north central Mexico largely fails or is diminished, then that greatly limits the amount of moisture that can come farther north and eventually end up farther east across western Kansas in terms of the monsoon season. Does Kansas see a monsoon season? No, not really. Western parts of Kansas a lot of times will benefit from some of the moisture that comes up from the southwestern monsoon. And if that is diminished, that again puts another strike on the board there in western Kansas for summertime moisture. If we look at August, much the same way. Okay, I would say average to drier than average there across most of Kansas. Better moisture farther to the south. As I've said before, I think we're going to have a very significant hurricane season. So maybe we can catch something late that gets some moisture up here, but most of our models are putting a lot of this tropical moisture farther south down across parts of Texas, the Gulf Coast, and then inevitably in the southeast. If we look at September, again, this is typical for La Nina to be drier than average during September. And if we go forward in October, it's the same story. Okay, so La Nina conditions obviously not good at all, especially for late summer into fall for the midsection of the country. If we look at in terms of a temperature forecast, this is for May, June, and July from the Euro seasonal model. It is forecasting warmer than average conditions across all of Kansas and some of the neighboring states. Not excessively so for Kansas, but warmer than average. If we look at July, August, September, the warmth is a little bit more, is a little bit stronger. I think some of the bigger anomalies will occur back over the Four Corners area, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, where the air is drier, where there's obviously going to be less water in the soil. So, especially for western Kansas, forecast just based off the Euro model, after we get past May, would be drier than average and warmer than average. Farther east, I think that moisture has a little bit more delayed going away, but still would be warmer than average would be the forecast just off the Euro. This is the NMME model. This is the model, remember, that brings the La Nina on faster and is more aggressive with how strong it is. But for the month of May, you see it's very active, not just across Kansas, but the neighboring states too. And that kind of owes to what I was saying and have been saying now for the past few months, that I thought May was going to be active, and also we had to be prepared for the severe weather potential in terms of hail. So if we continue to put water in the ground with these two systems and build on that thereafter, there's going to be moisture available to build severe thunderstorms, and hail could be a significant problem for some of us during the course of May, for sure. If we look at June, you see that wet anomaly goes away for pretty much all of Kansas. We go average to maybe slightly below average, but the real stout dry anomalies really start to show up back to the west and the southwest across New Mexico and Colorado. That trend continues into July. But as I said, if we don't have any good subtropical moisture coming north out of Mexico to exist across the four corner states and then eventually make its way into Kansas, it will inevitably be drier than average. And that's what the NMME model is showing here. If we look at August, that dry anomaly gets shoved a little bit to the north and obviously to the west. September, it's back as it should be because the La Nina episode would be in full force there. That dryness would continue into October, as you can see right there. Some real stout dry anomalies, southwest Kansas and southward. November, same story. In fact, down on the Gulf Coast, really dry. Really dry. And you might say, well, what are you worried about down there? And I'm like, if nothing's raining down there, it's going to make it harder to rain up here. So when you see those widespread dry anomalies, that's kind of what I'm getting at right there. In terms of temperature, this is for May, June, and July. The NMME model is forecasting, again, warmer than average conditions across all of Kansas for May, June, and July. No big surprises there. And then for July, August, September, even warmer than average. So we take it up another notch there, especially across the parts of the Corn Belt. But again, if the air is dry and the soil is dry, we will be warmer than average. That's just science right there. If we put more water in the ground than what we're suggesting here, then I would say those real warm anomalies would be skewed farther west, where simply put the air and the soil is drier. So as I said, in terms of temperature, it also largely hinges on how much water we put in the ground over the next, say, month and a half or so. But if I were a betting guy, I would say this summer is going to be warmer than average. Okay. So overall, the thoughts with this, the models have not performed well with the forecast for March and April. And to be honest, for Kansas specifically, historically, should Kansas have been this dry during an El Nino? No. We've just been unlucky in terms of the storm track. There's no way around that. We've got storms going north. We've got storms going south. As I said, eventually something will stick, and I'm hoping that's what the next 2 weeks shows us in terms of moisture. But I'm not going to be one to overpromise on this because, only a fool will forecast rain in a drought. Do I really think we are in a drought that is going to be really significant and build across Kansas? Well, this pattern that's coming up would say no, essentially because of how active it's looking and also the amount of moisture that's going to be present to start to fix some of the dryness that we have. So while I'm optimistic with what's going on, I still have that in the back of my mind. And that kind of alludes to that second statement right there. With May has the potential to be wet and stormy. This would also mean the hail risk obviously increases. I see summer being drier than average for many and hotter than average for many too. And I think that's especially true the farther west and southwest you go with the maps that I showed you. That diminished or slightly failed monsoon is still very much on the table, which has me worried for western Kansas for the reasons that I'd mentioned. The La Nina is going to take over and will likely make for a dry finish to 24 and start to 25. I don't see a whole lot of differences in that incurring. So you got to be real cautious and obviously plan accordingly going forward. And I think since a lot of us are already a lot drier than what we would like or what we need right now, we're already kind of in that same mold, in that pessimism mode to say it's just not going to rain. So we're planning for less rain than we would normally get. Do I think that's a sound model right now? I can't argue with it because you kind of have to say, well, it's going to be dry until it isn't. And that's what I'm saying. Hopefully the next couple of weeks we can really put a dent in some of that significant. At least I have the optimism that it'll go to work on some things here. So with that in mind, if you guys have questions, we can obviously talk about them.
Yeah, Brian, one of the questions that came in just asked, how long does La Nina last? And as you look at, obviously they're all going to be different, but some of those models showed pretty cold weather. I mean, do you see these going, 8 months? I mean, does it push into a year from now?
With the way the Pacific Ocean is stacked, so if you go back to where we started this in 2020, we continued it through early 23. So I think that may be a little bit more of an anomaly. Okay. So for this one, we had this El Nino break and then it comes back. If we look at just history and just say on average, how long would this last? I would say that this La Nina is at least going to last into the first third of 25. Okay. So late winter and spring, historically speaking, then La Nina departs. But we have to see how strong it gets, because I don't think we're very grounded on exactly how strong it's going to get. I have my own thoughts on that. I think that this event is going to be somewhat strong and may take a little bit longer to depart. So I'm pessimistic on the first part of 25 is what I'm getting at.
Okay. One of the other questions was, it looks like some of those models show a decently wet corn belt, at least here through summer, but it looked like Nebraska is probably going to be struggling with a similar drought to probably what Kansas has the potential to incur.
I would say the farther west you go, yes. The farther east you go, as I said, it's really going to depend on how much water we put in the ground, because the subsoil moisture in many cases is not there. So if we continue to see it not be there, it makes it that much easier for that drought creep, if you will, to take over and be more controlling. So I do think, areas farther east, if you look at Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, I got a lot of folks that always talk to me about the corn crop and say, "Oh, what's this going to do?" And I'm like, "Look, if it's raining in 2 out of 3 I states, you're probably not going to see a big market spike on something like that." And to be honest, with this huge glut of corn that we have right now that depresses the market, it's going to have to take a significant drought, not like what we saw last year. Remember, a lot of folks were crying about the drought in the Corn Belt last year, and all we did was produce a record crop. So, and I've been on the mindset of we have to kind of rewire our brains to say what is considered a drought now in the Corn Belt because of the crop genetics that are built in. I think we have to relook at that again, because if we had a drought last year and we produced a record crop, well, what is an average year, just an average year of water going to do to that? Well, it's going to take that and build it even more. You know what I mean? So, yeah. But if you're just thinking, well, how far east is this drought going to go? I definitely think the farther west you live, that the dry signal is going to be stronger, especially because of the way the weather pattern has been. Even though Nebraska, especially western Nebraska, has actually been getting some pretty good moisture lately.
Okay. We've had a pretty windy fall, or pretty windy spring. Do you see that continuing to carry on probably in through May and into June?
Wind always blows like crazy, March through May. So yes, absolutely.
Okay.
And especially because the weather pattern in May is going to be active. So if we have storm systems coming in, we are going to see some wind around here. The cure for that is putting a lot of water in the ground. Okay, because what that does is it cools the ground temperature down, and it doesn't allow the following days to heat up as much and stir up the atmosphere. So right now, with the dearth of moisture that we have right now in the ground, that's one of the big reasons why you're seeing the wind maybe be a little bit worse than what you would normally see this time of year. But let's be real, March, April, May are always windy.
Yeah.
It's just part of life in the plains.
With these two storms that are coming up, here up this weekend, do you see a lot of wind in those? Obviously, the potential around them, but cause for much damage with the wind, or just mostly hail potential?
Oh no, there'll be damaging wind with those storms. And so the thing about tomorrow is it's very conditional. And by conditional, I mean there are a lot of elements at play. How much do the storms coming out of Nebraska into Kansas overnight tonight cool the atmosphere down? How long does it stay cloudy in those places tomorrow? How much moisture can we funnel back out in western Kansas to build storms to begin with? There are a lot of elements tomorrow. Now, that being said, if we get storms to develop tomorrow, they will have the ingredients to produce some big hail. And by big hail, I greater than 2-inch diameter hail. Even tornadoes, there will be damaging wind gusts with those too. On Saturday, that focus shifts farther east. So across eastern Kansas, all elements of severe weather are on the table on Saturday. And that could even be potential for not only hail bigger than 3 inches in diameter, but some strong tornadoes. damaging wind gusts, and even flash flooding. And I know that sounds stupid considering we haven't had a whole lot of rain lately, but some of the amount of moisture that is going to come up and meet that storm coming out on Saturday looks fairly significant.
If you guys have any questions, feel free to type them in, and we can answer any of those. The other thing is Brian's able to send us out, you know, pieces of information, little articles or different things that are coming out. You know, as we look at these storms that are coming up, he usually is able to send some things out. So if you'd like to receive that, please reach out to somebody at Producer Ag, and we can get you added to a mailing list and get that to you. Seeing no questions, Brian, I appreciate you jumping on. I appreciate everybody else that joined us this evening. And we'll also have a recording of this. And so we can send that out too. Once again, just reach out to somebody at Producer Ag and we can go from there. Thank you, Brian.
Perfect. You guys stay safe, and I hope you get some water this next couple of days.
Me too.
All right.
Thanks.